Welcome, everyone. We are the Maine New Farmers Project through the University of Maine Cooperative Extension. The Maine New Farmers Project is funded by a grant through the USDA NIFA. And we are kind of a one-stop shop. We have a website that you can go to that shows a lot of the different new farmer programming that you can find in Maine, not just with Extension, but with all the different ag service providers throughout Maine. And we have a pretty good searchable site of figuring out if you need help with the marketing piece of farming, or you need help with growing vegetables. You can go to our website and go search through the different channels. So I'll be putting that in the chat. And today we're here to hear from Erica Berman. And Erica is the co-founder and executive director of Veggies To Table, which is an organic farm in Newcastle, Maine. They grow top quality organic produce and flowers to donate to local folks experiencing hunger and needing joy. They create lasting community connections through the volunteer program that they run and provide education around healthy food and sustainable living. So welcome, Erica. Thanks for coming to talk about Dahlia production today.
You're welcome. Hi, everyone. Well, thanks for the intro. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. What I'm going to do is share my screen and share my presentation that I hope will be helpful. There is a lot of information in there. So I'm going to give it to Chris and she will send it to all of you. So don't feel like you need to take notes unless you want to, but I will give her the presentation. There's a lot of links in there too that hopefully are helpful.
Erica, can I stop you for 1 second? I forgot to say, if you could hold your questions and just put them in the chat as Erica's talking, and then we'll get to question and answer at the end. Sorry about that, Erica.
Oh, no, that's okay. And then one other thing that Chris and I were just talking about, we are going to be doing one of those Twilight farm tours on August 20th, where you can come and see, we hope, lots of beautiful dahlias growing and many other flowers on our farm. We're in Newcastle, so I don't know where everyone's located, but so I'm going to share my screen. Well, actually not my screen, but my presentation. Let's see. Can everyone see that? Yes. Okay. So we are a nonprofit, so that's a little bit different than what many people might be doing. But nevertheless, I grow the dahlias. So I'm going to go into my first page. Chris already said a lot of this, but everything we grow, we donate.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, and if people aren't on mute, we can put mute on and then we'll take them off for the questions. So what we do, we never donate and we never sell any of our veggies, but I do sell some of my flowers and I do sell dahlia tubers because although many of you might not know this, dahlia tubers are edible. They're not the most amazing food and we don't ever donate them as food. I do donate the tubers and the flowers and sell them. So, but it's, we're a little different than a regular for-profit business, but all of this information, we give to like pantries and schools and summer lunch programs. We just can't bear people going hungry, but we also love to give the joy of flowers. And we've seen so much joy with the donation of flowers and with the sale of flowers too. So I'm going to go into, so this is like so much information. So I'm going to try to touch upon a lot of it and then we can talk through, so many of these points. What I tried to do is give like a really broad overview. It's not just like, if you want to be a commercial dahlia grower, it doesn't just mean growing dahlias that are pretty. There's a lot more to it. In order to get them out there and to get them sold. But I thought I would just give a teeny bit of information of how we got started We started in 2019, and I planted 40 tubers. And and if no one has experience with, I'm sure some of you have lots of experience and some of you have no experience, but you plant one tuber, and at the end of the season, when you dig it up, which one must do in Maine or else they will freeze and die, you end up with a clump, and the clump could have anywhere from 2 to 6 or 7 tubers in there. So I ended up with between 2019 and 2022. In 2022, I ended up planting from the 40, and I really didn't buy any other ones in. I bought in maybe like 4 or 5 extra, like different ones, like very minimal. I ended up in 2022 with 1,000 tubers planted in the ground. And from those 1,000 tubers, after we dug them and divided them, we had 6,000 tubers. And from the 6,000 tubers, we sold, I don't know how many I sold, but I ended up with $9,740 of revenue, and I donated 1,493, and I planted 1,500. So I guess we could say that I probably sold about 3,000 if I look at those numbers, but I can't say that for sure. So they're very expensive to invest in them, but they give back so much if you keep at it and you're digging them and you're dividing them. But what I wanted to I put a little arrow next to that 9,740. I also that was the first year we really sold our tubers, and I did not want to sell too many and overextend myself. So we probably could have made 2 or 3 times that had I really tried harder. But instead I decided to give lots away. And I'm guessing I probably gave away more than 1,493, but that's what I had recorded. And so what I did next was sort of say, can you succeed? Because if you want to have a commercial operation, you need to be in a market that's not saturated. And where I am, I'm lucky, even though I'm giving away a lot of them, I am selling them too, and we're not saturated. And then I guess the question you have to ask yourselves, where are you selling? Are you selling wholesale, retail? Are you having a CSA? Are you doing flower pop-ups? Those are kind of the things. Ooh, somebody's not on mute. Those are the things that I don't know how else you would sort of do it. So I chose the first year I sold flowers to do a CSA. And I think a CSA, again, it's sold right out really quickly. I think with a CSA, there's a lot of consideration. It wasn't just a Dahlia CSA, it was a flower CSA, but there were a lot of Dahlias in the flower CSA. That model is amazing. If people don't know what that is, it's community supported agriculture. You sell a certain number of subscriptions that people, so you've got the money, you know how many there are, and then you're making bouquets for them every week in season, which they're going to either pick up on the farm or in a trusted location. It's a really great option for people that have a for-profit farm, because you know how much revenue you've got it beforehand, and it works out really well. I didn't really like it for the nonprofit model, because in a nonprofit model, you're always wanting to meet new people and get new donors and more people on your farm. And a CSA is a fixed amount of people. But again, that's good for most people. So what I did last year is last 2 years, actually, we did flower pop-ups, and we did them in strategic places around the community. We met lots of new people. And I would say, for a for-profit farm, both options are good if you can do it, because then you're meeting new people that might want your CSA. But an important thing to do beforehand is can you doing a study of the market, who's selling flowers, where are they selling them? Is there money to be made in your community? And then studying, which honestly, I'm not really sure how you would do this, but studying the cost to grow, dig, and divide versus the revenue, because, my situation is slightly different in a nonprofit farm. We have a lot of volunteers that are helping us, although we do have paid crew. But it is very labor intensive to dig and divide dahlias. And then, so trying to figure out who's going to do it and how many you're growing and how long that's going to take is really important to see, because if I were to take that 9,740 and try to figure out how many hours of my life and my crew's life and volunteers, my guess is that we're not in the negative, but we didn't make billions of dollars either. So I think it's a really, really important consideration, because there's so much disappointment also if you try to like start this whole farm and you don't have a market, and then if you didn't make any money. So those are things that I would just give us a heads up. What I also wanted to sort of touch on was like, where are you, like if you're having this commercial operation, how are you getting the word out there? Like, and marketing is something that I think a lot of farmers, it falls to the wayside because you're so busy farming. But if you don't get the word out there, you might have the most amazing flowers ever, but nobody's going to know about it. So first and foremost, you need a name. You know, so that sounds simple, but you got to pick a name, and then you got to get a URL, and then you got to create a website, ideally, because, you know, you need to send people somewhere. And then social media, there's so many kinds of social media. I put what we do, you know, we use Squarespace for our website. It's not that expensive. You don't need to know HTML. It's pretty easy to fiddle around with. I use Instagram and Facebook. I really don't like Facebook very much, but it works. You know, you get a different audience between Instagram and Facebook, and I think it's important. I think LinkedIn is important too. And a newsletter is extremely important. We use MailChimp, but there's all sorts of, you know, there's Constant Contact. But when you're starting your farm, you should be thinking about who's going to buy these flowers. And the first and foremost people that might buy them are your friends and family. So get yourself a newsletter and shove everyone you know in there that you think might be interested. We did that when I started Veggies to Table, and now we're at almost 4,000 people in our newsletter. But when I started, I had 0. And, you know, so, but again, just remember, your friends and family are your biggest supporters. People often forget that that's the case. So, and, you know, I like MailChimp, you know, but there's so many other options. I just gave you like what I'm doing. There's so many, you know, I don't use TikTok, but I'm sure that TikTok could be highly useful. I don't know, but I don't use it. But I'm sure, you know, other people will. I thought it would be helpful for you to see. I kind of listed out all the different platforms that we use. You know, we use Squarespace, Instagram. Planoly is a really nice, very inexpensive app that you can use, so that if you post something on Instagram, it will go also onto Facebook. So you're not like doing, and then it also helps you to see, you can like program things in advance. It's a very easy, I like it because I do a lot of social media and I find that works well for me. So I put that on there, but then I put a lot of other things on there that one must be thinking of, like QuickBooks for accounting, and are you using Square or Stripe for your credit card payments, and or Venmo and PayPal, you know, are using the Google Drive to store your documents. Like there's a lot of, you know, depending if you have a team, like I have a team, we use the Google Drive, we use Square when we're at an event because it's mobile and it's on your phone. Stripe, you know, I'm not sure, like we use Stripe on our website. I'm not sure if we could just use Square. I feel like Square is more of an app for the market, but I'm not sure. But we have both. So I just, you know, and people love Venmo. Venmo's amazing. It's very convenient. The business Venmo is a little bit newer, but I haven't quite set it up yet, but I'm working on it. And I think Venmo has lower fees than Square and Stripe. So that's an important consideration too. And then, you know, some people really like PayPal. So I put them in, you know, the best thing is if you get people to send you checks, but in the meantime, when you're at events, you want to make sure that you can capture their money. In terms of growing the dahlias, I have a lot of resources on there, but I thought I would sort of just go through. I don't know where you're all located. Where I am on the mid coast in zone, I don't know if it's changed actually with that new chart, but we were zone 5B. I don't know if that's changed, but you know, sort of like I kind of have 2 columns there of what we're doing. We're planting our dahlias in early, so you'll see that we're going from June basically through November, December in our season, even a little earlier, but We are planting in June in our field or in a tunnel. I have not had a tunnel, which I do now. I'm guessing that you could probably get them in a little sooner in a tunnel. But you can pot them up before in a greenhouse, so they're grown a little bit more beforehand before you plant them. You never want to plant where you have fear of a frost, because they will freeze and you will be very disappointed. So you want to make sure your ground is not going to freeze. By doing that, you're going to get your first blooms like end of July, early August, and then they're going to go through till frost. If you're in a place like we are, where you might get one frost and then the second one like 3 weeks later, well, obviously if you're in a tunnel, then you're probably going to be protected. But if you're out in the field and you don't have that many, you could try to row cover them or something. But dahlias get very tall, so that might be a little tricky. So here we get a frost at end of September sometimes, and sometimes this year it was October 23rd. So like this past season was an incredible, crazy dahlia season, because we got an extra month of blooms. But every year is different. In the 6 years I've been doing it, we've had 2 end of October, like October frosts, and the rest of them have been like September 20th, around then. So, but again, it really depends where you are. And then they love the cool nights. They do really, but they don't like frost, but they love the cool. They thrive in the fall. They just go crazy in the fall. So, and then I just kind of put a bunch of, I don't know how much I should really like go through this, but that you're cutting them down. You cut them down after the first frost, they'll turn black, the leaves will turn black, and then you're going to cut them down and leave a few inches. And then the wisdom says to wait a couple of weeks to leave them in the field, so unless there's a hard frost coming, which then you want to get them right up because they'll get ruined. But otherwise you leave them in the field for a couple of weeks. They're like hardening, and it's better for them if you can do that. And that's when, after that, you're digging, you're washing, you're drying, you're dividing. After you divide, you have to leave them, like when you divide, you can imagine that they have a wound, and you want that wound to heal for like a day or so before you're packing them up in your medium, which we will talk about as well. And then you're going to want to store them in a place where they are not going to freeze, and that they have a high humidity. Like they say, like 40 degrees, 40 to 50 is a really good temperature. 40 is, I think, even a little better. We store ours in like Sterilite containers that I get at Rennie's, but people store them in all sorts of things. People store them in all sorts of mediums. There's a lot of debate about it. We store ours in peat moss, and I know peat moss is considered like it's a little bit controversial. That said, I reuse it, and it works well for me. I tried wood shavings this year, so we'll see. I have a few dahlias and wood shavings to see how they do. Dahlias shrivel, and you don't want them to shrivel you don't want them to mold, and you don't want them to shrivel too much. So my fear is that in wood shavings, they're going to dry out. Certain places, including the American Dahlia Society, tell you that you can wrap them in saran wrap. I do not recommend that. I tried it out of curiosity. It is a waste of, it's so bad for the environment. They mold in there. It's just not ideal. So, and then, people use newspaper and whatever. I use peat moss, and I quite like it, but we'll see we'll see what happens with the wood shavings. Then you store them away, you're checking on them over the winter, you're spritzing them if they look like they're drying. And then most people like dahlia sales, depends. Like the big growers are sort of selling them in November, December. We did our sale in January, February even, and did really well with that. You want to ship them April, May, pick up May. I mean, nobody's planting them in Maine, but it depends where you're selling them. No one can really plant them before June anyway in Maine. What I have written over there, to be aware, we had a terrible, horrible thing happen last year with our dahlias. So as I mentioned, I had 1,500 dahlias in the ground. We had an extra long month of season. The woman that I was working with noticed that we had a few yellow leaves. Our dahlias were gorgeous. That said, the yellow leaves, since we had this extra long season, became more and more prevalent. and we ended up testing them. And it turns out that we had contracted this thing called Dahlia mosaic virus, which I had never even heard of. So I wasn't looking for it. But as a commercial grower, you would want to be very, very on top of this, which now I will be very on top of. It's a virus that lives in the tuber and in the stalk and in the flowers, and is spread through cutting and through bugs. And apparently it is like in over 70% of dahlia stock in the United States. And the way that I believe we got it is somebody had donated some dahlias to me, like to be nice, because she was having knee surgery and she couldn't plant them. And it was quite a lot of dahlias. And so I like separated them from mine, assuming that if they got sick, they would be fine. Well, they weren't sick, except apparently they might have had this virus, and it spreads through cutting and it spreads through aphids. So we ended up infecting our whole crop, and I ended up having to make the choice to throw them all out, because by the time we realized it, over 75% of them tested positive out of the ones that we tested. And I can't be selling dahlias that I know could be potentially affecting someone. So it was really heartbreaking, because if you take 1,500 times anywhere from $10 to $30 per tuber, it is worth a lot of money and a lot of joy. But I just couldn't take the risk. And after that, I'm friendly with a number of dahlia growers, and the woman at the botanical gardens mentioned that the same thing happened to her. And it turns out that the ones that were donated to me and the ones that she had were bought from the same source. So what I would say is I buy from small farms. I have them on the right-hand side. I bought from Skyfall Flowers, Five Fork Farms. They're small. Floret Flowers has a list, but I would be aware that their list does have the large dahlia grower on it that had the infected tubers. So I put that on there, and then I realized maybe I should have taken it off. I would say, local farms, and then we'll be doing another tuber sale as soon as we're buying in, and we're doing a fundraiser right now to buy in. We'll never get back to 1,500, but if we even get somewhere between 500 and 1,000, we'll be back in business to be selling again. But it's something to really be aware of that I wasn't aware of. There are other things that dahlias can get. My dahlias have never got anything, and so that's why I was really shocked when they got this. I would say pruning and airflow are very important. And then I would say, what I wanted to do is not talk too much, but I want to go to a couple more pages, and then, all of this you're going to get, there's a lot of stuff on here. All the pink things are links to the resources and things like that. And you can all ask me questions about, I don't know, I'm not going to go through how we spacing. I mean, you can ask me, but I think, if I had to tell you spacing and T-post, we only have an hour. So, but I have on the next page, this is, you can see our tubers after they were dug up, and in the dividing process, and also where they're getting packed up in peat moss. And so I just thought it would be good to and then you can also sort of see what we're using to do a lot of this. And then on the next page, I had just put some pretty dahlia pictures to see a lot, and how much joy those, on the lower left-hand corner during COVID, we donated tons of dahlias to the essential workers at Hannaford and the hospital, all over the place. So much joy, so much beauty, and potentially a lot of money, if you have the market for it. And then the last slide just shows how you can get a hold of me if anyone has questions, or, Chris is going to be sending stuff out too. But I thought, I'm going to unshare. I don't know how to do that. So that then hopefully you guys will have questions, because that was a ton of information really fast, so that we have a half an hour or even a little more for people's questions, which I hope you'll have, because I could have spent a lot more time on all of that, and I can bring it back up again if you want to, but it's hard for me to know the balance of questions to talking.
Erica, I have a question.
Sure.
So when you're planting your tubers, and you're looking to plan for what you're going to have for tubers to sell next year, is there a rule of thumb? If you plant a pound of tubers, you get 5 pounds at the end of the season when you dig them back up? Is there any ratio?
I've never weighed tubers, like, so, and I'm not sure, like, I mean, I can't tell you, like, like one tuber gives you this many blooms. I don't know that. I mean, I can tell you that one tuber will give you usually 3 to 5 tubers, like but anywhere from 2 to 6, like sometimes it could be 7 to 10. Like it could be like, it really just depends on the tuber. But in pounds, I've never like weighed them, so I can't, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's just a question. And you have lots of questions in the chat. Have you ever tried storing tubers in waste wool? Maine Fiber Shed is collecting uses for waste wool, and this might work.
It might. I would say again, the most important things, tumors need humidity. So if you like wool, you might just need to spray it, to like keep it damp, but not too damp. I'd say it's a really great, sounds like a really great thing to try out for sure.
All right. And then we have a comment that Floret does not sell Dahlia tubers anymore.
No, they don't sell tubers, but they have a list of resources. And they do actually sell seeds, but the seeds of dahlias that you can plant dahlias from seeds. It just takes longer. And they are selling seeds. I saw actually they have a sale that went on sale today, but the seeds are, it's more the smaller varieties. So if you want the larger varieties, a lot of people sell the seeds, but I actually have some of those mixes. I was going to try one this year out of curiosity, but it seems like there's a lot of quite smaller dahlias. Like there's lots of kinds of dahlias. A lot of people love the dinner plate ones. Those are the bigger ones because those you can sell for a lot more money and they're really pretty. And then the smaller ones are pretty in bouquets, but they're, but yes, they do not sell tubers for sure, but they provide resources, and I put a link on there to their resources, but again, be aware that there could be some that you might want to be aware of on there. That's all I can say.
Okay, another question. How is climate change affecting you?
Well, again, like all I can say is we've had 2 years of the 6 years that I've been growing that the season extended a month. So that extended month is a huge amount of potential revenue for somebody who was selling them. And for us, not only were we selling some of them, we were donating them. So we were able to donate so many more bloom, and we couldn't harvest them fast enough. I did not have the enough people to get, like, we considered, but this is when we found out we had the virus, so we didn't do it. We considered like having a pick your own. There were so many, because again, dahlias were loving those October temperatures and they were just so plentiful. So climate change has given us, such an extended season for 2 of the 6 years, I guess, that I've grown them. But in terms of other things, I haven't really seen that you could plant them earlier, because it's still kind of chilly and the ground's not ready. Obviously, wind is something to be aware of. This year, it was a very windy year and a very rainy year. Dahlia's tubers don't like to be too wet. So that's one of the things that's really important. But strangely, so if you plant them, they can rot if you water them too much initially before that. You're not even, the common wisdom is you don't water them until they've broken through the soil. Because it's raining anyway. If you were in like a desert, I'm assuming that would be like different. But around here, you don't have to water them but then they do need regular water. But this year we had some that were blown over by wind. I mean, we stake ours with T-bars and Portanova netting, or else they would all fall over. But the wind is a definite climate change thing to be aware of, because dahlias can get super tall. I mean, the ones that we had this year, some of them were over 6 feet tall. So like the plants themselves. So wind will be an issue. And then obviously massive storms will be an issue too. But strangely, even though last year was literally one of the rainiest seasons on record, it was also our most bountiful. That said, maybe that's where the virus came from too. I don't know. Maybe it's because it was so wet and moldy. It's hard to really say. My guess is it came from this woman who nicely donated the dahlias to me. But so yeah.
Erica, when as a follow-up to that, when you have years that have been really dry, what do you do for watering? What does your watering system look like?
We use drip, and I set the drip up, and then I would water them, for sure. And if it was like uber dry, but it's never been that I've had to water them before they've come up. Like it's never been that, even 2 years ago when we had the drought. But honestly, when I think back to it, I think we would have done better, because last year was the rainiest season on record, and 2 years ago was like a drought. And I think I should have probably watered them more. I've also tried what you can do. I've only done it once, but you can take the tubers, and if you have a greenhouse, you can put them in pots, pot them up, and like have them sprout before June, and then you put them in and they've got a head start. What I found interestingly, I did that 2 years ago, which was the drought year, so it's hard to know. The plants were they were up, but between those ones and the ones that I just planted in the ground, I didn't see a huge difference in when I got the flowers, but it was certainly a huge amount more work. Like we literally, it was a lot of work. So I might try it again this year. Last year I didn't do it. So, but those ones I did give a little water to. They were in a greenhouse and they were like dry. Obviously if they're like uber dry, they can't grow either. But dahlias are they like to be stored in moisture. They're moist. If they shrivel and they will shrivel. If they shrivel too much, like way too much, you'll know, and then you're going to throw them out. If they're a little shriveled, they're mostly okay. Like obviously they need them to have not obviously, dahlias need to have an eye. So that's like the most important thing that you need to grow a dahlia, is that it has an eye. So if it's like a little shriveled and has an eye, it'll still grow. But yeah, the watering, it's kind of a fine line. You don't want to over or underwater, I guess I would say.
Okay. This is a question about your CSA. Will you share your CSA structure, like the number of weeks, the start date, costs for the season? It seems to be all over the place in Maine. Size of weekly bouquets, stem count of the main flowers.
Sure. We did 10 weeks. I think I started at end of July. This was this was 23, 22, 21. I guess it was in 2021. So a while ago. And we charged $200 for the 10 weeks. I think it was too cheap. And because then when we made, and I don't know the stem count, I always like made them too big because I was like, oh, they'll just give them more flowers. So it's hard for me to say. One of the best pieces of wisdom I received was I took 25 CSA members, and like I was like, oh, we could get 40, we could get 50, and like I talked to some other flower growers. It is a lot of work. I guess it depends on how many people you're making the bouquets with, if it's just you, if you have a team, whatever. It was a lot of work to make the 25 bouquets, and I'm so glad that I didn't take on more. I could have. I was lucky because I give away so many of my flowers. So many people knew about us, and we sold out with one email. I didn't have to do a press release. I didn't have to put it on social. It just sold out. And I was very tempted to go bigger, but I'm glad that I did not. I would say what was also hard that year was it was a pretty rainy year, and I didn't have any place under cover to be making the bouquets. That's a pretty big consideration too, and I didn't have cold storage. So now I have cold storage, now I have undercover, but like it's important to be able to store your blooms. Like ideally you want to harvest your blooms at the end of the day when it's cooler, but and they're dry, as opposed to the morning when they're wet and cool, because wet blooms aren't so great. So there's a lot of considerations about like when and how much, but I wish I knew how many stems were in there, but I don't. And they were a mix of so many flowers. We had zinnias and dahlias and sunflowers and celosia and amaranth and ammi and bachelor's buttons. I don't know. We grow it's not just dahlias. We're talking about dahlias, but we grow so many kinds of flowers. The ones like the focal flowers are really like zinnias, sunflowers, and dahlias that I've grown. We don't have roses, or I've never done lisianthus. But then we've got so many other really beautiful flowers on the farm. It would be hard. for me, because we don't have greenhouses per se, to go earlier than the end of July. Someone with a, and then you could also do a very brief CSA of tulips if people grew tulips, because tulips come early in May, I think they're up. And again, I've never grown tulips in a tunnel. You know, I've seen people who have tulips like now because they're growing them in heated greenhouses and things, but tulips come first. You could also do something with peonies and anemones and oh, there's another flower that comes from a corn that's really pretty. There's a few that, you know, if you had greenhouses, you could be doing a lot in spring, but we have not done that.
Okay, great. Next question. Where do you source peat moss and do you reuse it each season?
Yeah, so I've just bought the peat moss from our local hardware store. You can get it, I'm sure, at Tractor Supply. Probably, you know, we've gotten it from Ames, which is in Wiscasset. I get it. We're in Denver. There's a Damascotta hardware store. We do reuse it. I threw it out this year after what happened with the tubers, even though that was like an excess of caution because it doesn't live in the peat moss. But the thing I've learned about peat moss is that it's not all created equal. Some is really, really wet. Some is really, really dry. I kind of hate peat moss, but it's like a necessary evil. It's horrible to breathe. It's bad. Like, you know, I wear a mask when I treat, some people are more sensitive to it. I'm extremely sensitive to it. So like I have to wear a mask around it. Then it settles down. But yeah, I reused it. So like why I don't feel so bad about it is because we reused it for multiple years and, you know, that was fine. Some people use something else that people use that is even worse than peat moss that I can't think of the name of it now. But, you know, the shavings would be great because they're less worrisome. They're any like a byproduct. So I'll be interested. I did save a few of our tubers. I threw them all out except for a few to do some testing, you know, so that I put them in some in peat moss, some in shavings, because shavings I think would be a really, really good alternative. Newspaper, I just can't imagine that they're not going to dry out. And then yeah, the wool I would be super interested to hear about, although you'd have to have a lot of, like, it depends how many you're growing. You would need a lot of wool, you know, like, 'cause we have like, you know, it depends how many dahlias you're growing, but like when we dug up the 1,000 and got the 6,000, I can't tell you how many sterilite containers you would need a lot of wool. Like, you know, you would need to have someone who was giving you tons of wool. So, but I would be interested to hear about that.
All right. We have someone asking, where do you find guidelines for planting the tubers commercially? So
Like spacing?
it sounds like it, yeah.
Yeah, I think I took them from Florette and she plants them very close together. And they make like a hedgerow, and that's always been great for me, except until we had this virus. Like some people plant them uber far apart. Like, you know, like we were planting ours, the smaller, because tubers are all not all created equal. Like some are small, some are medium, some are large sized, also just like the dahlias themselves. So I think the guidelines, it's like a foot for the small ones, 18 inches, and then 2 feet for the bigger ones. But that is really creating like a hedgerow, like, and they're very close together. So if you're concerned about airflow and health, then for, you know, but I've always been more concerned about space because we have a small farm and I wanted to get the most in. And plus, when they're growing close together, they're sort of, they don't fall over as much, I would say. You know, they're supporting each other to a certain degree. But I've heard of people, you know, some people plant them like really far apart, you know, but we grow in, all of our beds are 30 inches wide. And so I've been able in a 30-inch wide bed to get 3 across, actually, you know. I mean, that's really pushing it. You could, you know, 2 is more comfortable, and then, you know, 1 is like uber healthy, but we just don't have enough beds to do that. So I think there's like so many ways, us and so many things we plant, to the spacing. Like there's so many ways of spacing. And if I could share my document again if that was helpful. I don't know, like if that would prompt any questions. I just like shut it because I thought I would see faces, but I only see Mark. So
Oh, we have lots more questions.
okay, good.
Okay. What humidity do you recommend? And I think this is in terms of storage.
I think they recommend really high humidity. I forget, but I'm pretty sure it's high. I have been storing them in my basement, which I don't know, isn't as humid as one would think, but they've done really well. But I think that's an easy, I could Google it now, but you can Google. But like they basically, if it's not humid enough, you just want to spritz them. Like you don't want them to dry out and get all shriveled because the more, they're nice. You want them when they're like plump. But that would be an easy thing to Google and see the recommended humidity. Sorry, I don't know it.
This question is, what soil structure or garden design is best for growing and easiest for harvesting? I think you've kind of answered that one.
Yeah, I mean, you want to be fertile. We always give them, when we're planting them, bulb tone, and then when they're growing, we put a foliar spray. But you want your soil to, dense packed clay soil is going to be tricky. Obviously fluffier, fertile soil is going to be nicer. Garden design, again, we're growing for production here, not necessarily for beauty, although they end up being really beautiful anyway. If it's a home garden or a garden, obviously that's going to be different. And then you can do all sorts of fun things.
Okay. This person asked, do you wake up earlier and take cuttings? If so, when do you start?
So again, I have found, like the first year when I had my CSA and I didn't have cold storage and I didn't have anywhere undercover, I was cutting in the morning because it's cool, but in the morning they're wet. And wet flowers aren't so great. Like they're all right, I guess, if you're like cutting them and making bouquets and selling them right away and not putting them into cold storage, which I didn't have that year. But now that I have cold storage, I tend to harvest in August, anywhere like after 4 or even at like 5. So you're out there like 5 to 8, which is a lot of fun if you've been up since like 5 a.m. already. But and then harvesting them, you're with dahlias, pretty much any flowers, you want to get the lower leaves off, and then you're putting them in buckets, and then we put them in the cold storage, and then the next day we're like making our bouquets usually. So I don't usually harvest in the morning unless I really had to, or if I was doing an event that they weren't going to go into storage. But and you never would want to harvest if you can avoid it in the heat of the sun. And as the season progresses, September, October, obviously you can be harvesting a little earlier because the light is less and it's less hot. August is the trickiest month because it's so hot, and you want to, it's not, if you harvest them in the heat of the sun, they're going to wilt. And then in the morning they're wet. So
Erica, so much good information. Next question. Do you replant in the same location each year?
No. I mean, you could, but after I've learned what I've learned, I will definitely not be planting, because like even though the virus doesn't grow in the soil, I'm sure when you dig your tubers, you're digging with pitchforks. You can't see the clumps. The clumps are quite large, as you can see in some of the pictures that I was showing you and that you're going to get. I'm sure we've missed some, so I rotate. But I mean, flowers aren't quite the same as vegetables. I guess you could, but I wouldn't recommend it, honestly.
And what do you use for pricing guidelines?
Well, because we're a nonprofit, that's where it gets a little tricky. When we say, I don't, and I get, this was Dahlia growing. So, we've been selling bouquets at certain price points, but I am not the best person to tell you for that. I'm guessing that there are a lot of resources out there to find, and maybe Chris, I'm not sure what the best resources are. One of the things that I did before I started the CSA is I Googled all the other local farms in Maine to see what they were charging. And I guess that would be the best thing to do. Like there's a lot of local farms in Maine that are selling flower CSAs and flower stems. So that was what I did. But then I bet you there's also like even further guidelines. I don't know, but that was really helpful to me. It lets you know, because some people do like, we did 10 weeks. Some people also do a 5-week option. Some people do, there's all different things you can do, and then the price would be different. And I decided that was going to be a real headache. So I just did like the 10-week option, but it was super helpful to see what other people are doing and the size of their bouquets and what kind of stems. And it was pretty easy to Google, Maine farm flower CSA, whatever. So I think that would, and then I also am always interested when I go to like Rising Tide or Co-op, if they have flowers, or the farmers market, anywhere I'm going, I'm like looking. But in terms of like true guidelines, which I'm sure truly, especially for wholesale flowers, I know that exists. I just don't know where to find those.
Yeah, and I don't believe that anyone here would be doing that type of business yet. But yeah, I think that's a great answer. To
I
do that
actually
market
have a
research.
flower farm, so I could weigh in if you'd like.
I'd
Sure.
love that.
So personally, I'm in Down East near Bar Harbor, so the market is a bit higher end with the tourism industry and everything. But when I was starting out, like you said, seeing what other farms are charging, a big thing that I recommend is when you're starting out to not underprice your goods just because you don't know what they are worth, because that kind of shoots everybody in the foot a little bit. But the best wholesale guide to kind of start off of, and then, if you want to use that, is the Boston wholesale market, which they have an updated list that they bring in every week online, and that's through the USDA. And yeah. And then like if you want to find your retail price, basically going off of the Boston market, timesing it by 2 or 3 or more, depending on your market, is like a good starting range.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Next question. How do you manage pests, bugs to deer? Are there any companion crops for natural pest control?
Deer don't like dahlia. We didn't have a fence on our farm until this year, actually, and deer just have never touched the dahlia. This year, so was the first, it was really bad for us, and I think for a lot of people, Japanese beetle season. And I've always heard that Japanese beetles like dahlias and always been like, oh, we're so lucky. They've never been in my dahlias. Well, let me tell you, they were in our dahlias this year, and we handpicked them multiple times a day. They really ruin your dahlias. They go right into the center and it's a bitch. Like, and I'm not really sure what else you can really do. I mean, because I'm not sure how you would row cover them from the Japanese beetles. We also had aphids this year at the end of the season, which also I know spread the mosaic virus. So, but it's the first time that that's ever happened to us. But so I'm not like, I've never had to deal with it before, so I don't really have a good answer, except for this again was the first year that we had the Japanese beetles and hand picking them. But I'm sure in terms of companion, it's interesting because the dahlias, they really cover this, they grow big and cover the soil. And the way we've grown it, there hasn't really been room for companions. I guess there could be underneath, but they wouldn't get any light. So I don't know, but it would be an interesting thing, like how to get away the Japanese beetles for sure. And if anyone knows that, I'm like all ears. I would love to hear.
All right, next question. What would be your top suggestions for growing dahlias with the bare minimum of labor during the growing season?
Well, it's not a lot of labor. The dahlias don't become labor until you're digging and dividing. So, I mean, you plant them, you got to give them water. I always prune the lower leaves so that they have better airflow, but it's not a lot of work. But then, you have to pick them. That work, give them, we have drip irrigation, or you wouldn't want overhead. I don't think, I don't recommend that. So you have to water them, but there's no way to get around digging and dividing them. And that is a lot of work. So, and that is at the end of your growing season. So I'm not sure what to say about that. I mean, they are kind of the amount of work that they are, but when they're growing, they're not like a ton of work.
Okay, and where do you overwinter all of the containers of tubers?
In my basement, because my basement doesn't freeze. What I've found is my basement is actually a little warm because it's not heated, but the heat goes down from our house into it. And they do start growing a bit, but it's been fine. So, people, if you had a connected garage, they just can't freeze. So you need to be really careful. They need to be in a building that's not gonna freeze. And it's, has some humidity, or that you're providing spritzing so that they get humidity. I feel like it's like 86%, but I could be making that up. I don't know. Like I'm kind of curious now to know like how much humidity dahlias need. Now I'm very curious.
Maybe Madison knows.
I don't know if she's still here. I think she left.
Oh,
I'm gonna Google it.
The next question is, how do you package your flowers? Do you wrap your flowers? Who do you buy your bouquet wraps and flower food packets from?
So yeah, 75 to 80% relative humidity, just FYI. So we have been buying from Johnny's, but I've heard there's cheaper places like, like those like sleeves. I put them in sleeves, and I haven't been, I know you should, but using a little food things and things like that. So I can't speak to that. Something I want to do this year, maybe to like them, but they last a really long time. I don't know. I haven't had a problem. Like they've last, and like usually we're cutting and selling really quickly. Like some people like might, or donating, you could store them, like they store forever in cold storage. So then you would definitely need the food, but I can't really speak to that. So like I've been putting on those sleeves. And the problem with the sleeves, it's kind of tricky. You're cutting them, you're putting them in like buckets, and then if you put them in the sleeve, then the sleeve might get wet. So I tend to not put them in the sleeve till I actually give them to someone, unless I'm selling them to like a shop that's going to be selling them. And then I've done some experimentation with stickers and stamps. I like both. But both have their pluses and minuses. Stamps are cheaper, but they don't always work well. And they don't, if you stamp it onto your like sleeve and then it doesn't work, you lost a sleeve. And then the stickers, I like stickers, but I've also experimented with little tags. I like tags where I'm stamping on a tag, but then the tag, like everything, you have to be careful that it doesn't get wet. It's basically, it's a little tricky. But I would, yeah, I'm going to be experimenting with giving them some flower food. But I have noticed that dahlias in cold storage last like a long time, so then you definitely would want to give them their food.
Great. And the last question we have in the chat is, are there good companion plants that could also be harvested or would help the dahlias to stand up in the wind or for other reasons?
Yeah, again, that's not something I've ever done because of the tightness of my planting for them and the need for me to use all my space just for the dahlias where I'm planting the dahlias. So in terms of the wind situation, we really use the Hortanova, and I use 2 layers of it usually. You could potentially get away with 1 layer, but 2 layers, which is a bitch to take off in the fall. And the T-post every 10 feet with the Hortanova. In like the major storm we had, I only had a few that fell over through that. Like it was very minimum. But in terms of like other plants that would help them, I guess that would come down to like if you're like spacing them super far apart, then yeah, you would have to figure something out. But I haven't done that, so I can't speak to that, unfortunately. They do go, you can do them against a fence too, that's helpful, I suppose, maybe, but.
And have you noticed any aesthetic preferences amongst customers, color, size, or whatever?
People love dinner plate dahlias. The problem with dinner plate dahlias, then you're going to want to, what I found, they're harder to put in a bouquet. So you'd sell them as stems, but, yeah, it's everyone's different. So like everyone has different preferences and tastes, and dahlias are pretty much so gorgeous. It's kind of hard to go wrong. I'd say Cafe au lait is one of the ones that everyone like loves as a dinner plate dahlia. And I do really like them too, but I like one, like I put one in a boot, like they're just so beautiful on their own. But yeah, the links that I put in there, Skyfall and Five Fork, they have really pretty dahlias. And then there's like so many others. There's so many cool dahlias out there. Now I'm just going to be really wary of where I'm going to buy them from. And I would just say, like, I don't want to like name, I don't know, like if people emailed me, but I feel bad naming the place that had the ones, but it is a little worrisome. Like I would definitely recommend. And not everyone, like, you know, I bought some from Bumbleroot Farm in southern Maine, but I've never bought some from them before. So we'll see how they had some nice ones too. But yeah, I think it's a preference thing. Like I'm a big pastel-y and I'm not a big yellow dahlias, but some people really, you know, some people love yellow. I think it's really a personal preference.
Well, those are all the questions in the chat.
That's a lot of
Did you?
questions.
That was a lot of
I love
questions. A
it.
lot
I'm
of
glad
great
that,
interest.
does anyone else have a question that is hiding behind a blank screen that wants to ask me? If not, that's awesome. Hi, Parker.
Yeah, I have one more question. For the dahlia tubers that are infected with the mosaic, is that still something that's safe if you're just interested in the cut flower market and not selling the tubers?
No, I wouldn't do it. And the reason I wouldn't do it is because it spreads through the sap. So when you cut the flower, it's spreading through the sap. So you could sell your tubers in a truly, like it is possible that you would sell someone flowers. Like for example, sold my flowers and gave them away to people who were growing their own dahlias, and then they could be, you know, you're supposed to, when you put your flowers in the water, you can cut the stems to keep them growing longer. Someone could use those same shears to go out into the field and infect their own dahlias. I just wouldn't want to take that risk. And like, we really thought a lot about it. And I could not knowingly save them. So even though they were so gorgeous. And you know, Chris can attest to that. Like you could not tell, and we would have never known, because if we'd have gotten a frost in September, we would have never known we had that virus, because there was no yellowing in September. It all came in October. So yeah, I don't recommend it.
And then a question that might actually be for Chris, for folks who are interested in starting up, but the cost of the initial tubers is so high, does Cooperative Extension or other farm partners have any kind of like help you start your dahlia farm programs or get discounted tubers or other resources like that?
Well, thanks for asking that question, Parker. Typically, no, there aren't any specific grants for getting your farm started. It's just like any other small business. You're going to want to go to your local FSA, USDA office and get registered with them. And they're going to have lots of great resources for you in terms of getting your business off the ground, and different low-cost ag loans that you'd be able to tap into. There's lots of information about that on our website. So I will send a follow-up email to all of you who registered. I assume you all registered, and include that information. But that was a great question, Parker. Thanks. And there was one more question in the chat. How big are your containers, your Rennie's containers, and how many tubers fit in them?
The Rennie's containers, I think I wrote that on there. Hold on, because I Googled it. Hold on, let me look. Did I write it in my thing? 23 times 16 times 6 are the ones that I like. But those you can fit, it just depends how the size of your tubers. So we have fit anywhere from 20 to 150 tubers in one of those. You're layering them, and you don't want to layer them so they can touch each other. So it's like you put a little peat moss, your tubers, peat moss, tubers. It really depends on the size of the tubers. And then you can also use smaller ones as well. That's just the size that I've really liked. I drill holes in the top to let them breathe, but then I like to read stuff, and then I was reading, like, someone was saying they tested both ways, with and without the holes, and they didn't see a difference. I don't know. But yeah, I like those Sterilites, and Rennie's has tons of them. You can get them in also, UMaine and whatever, but if I can get them at Rennie's, I'm happier, because at least I feel like I'm helping a local business.
That's a great point. Well, thank you so much, Erica. This was such good information. And like I said, I'll send a follow-up email with all of her great resources that she shared with us today, and more.
And feel free to email me. My email's on there if you have any specific questions. And if anyone wants to visit the farm or like come plant or whatever, like, you know, there's plenty to you know, we were happy to show. It's a lot. It's a lot to like take in. So
Yes, sure is.
and
Well,
then
thank
coming
you
up-
so
yeah,
much.
thank you. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see some of you on August 20th too. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone.